The chandeliers blazed like captive stars, showering golden light across the crystal hall of the Grand Imperial Hotel. The air smelled of roses imported from Paris, and the laughter of the city's richest men and women floated through the grand ballroom like a cruel symphony. Tonight was the annual charity gala, a night where fortunes were flaunted, alliances were formed, and reputations could be destroyed in a single careless moment. Richard Evans, the dashing young CEO of Evans Technologies, had arrived at the center of this glittering universe. He was tall, polished in his custom tuxedo, and his hand rested smugly on the waist of a stunning brunette in a crimson gown. The woman was not his wife. She was Vanessa Moore, his mistress, the woman he had been parading around the office for months as though daring anyone to challenge him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard declared into the microphone, flashing a smile designed to melt resistance, "thank you for joining us tonight. Evans Technologies is proud to sponsor this gala for children's education. But tonight is about more than business. It is about love, beauty, and the future we create together." His words dripped with false sincerity, but the crowd still clapped. They always clapped. Because money silences doubts, and charm covers sins. Yet beneath the applause, whispers rippled like an undercurrent. Everyone knew who Vanessa was. Everyone also knew Richard's wife was 6 months pregnant. Where was she tonight? The answer came with the sudden creak of the ballroom doors. Gasps fluttered through the hall like startled birds. Standing at the entrance was Claire Evans, Richard's wife, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She wore a simple ivory dress, one that could not compete with Vanessa's designer gown, yet her presence commanded attention. Her eyes, wide with betrayal, but shimmering with quiet dignity, locked on her husband. The music faltered. Some guests looked away in pity, others leaned forward in delight, hungry for scandal. Clara stepped forward, her heels tapping against the marble floor like a drumbeat of defiance. Richard froze for only a moment before recovering his smirk. "Darling," he said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut, "I didn't expect you here." Vanessa laughed softly, clinging tighter to his arm. "Oh, but isn't it sweet? She wanted to surprise you." Clara's lips trembled, but she stood tall. "Surprise? No, Richard. I came to remind you that while you stand here flaunting your mistress, your child is still inside me. Your family is not a costume you can discard for the night." The room buzzed with gasps. A few guests applauded under their breath at her courage, but most held theirs, waiting for Richard's reaction. And Richard laughed. He threw back his head and laughed, as though the very idea of loyalty, of family, of love was a joke to him. His laughter echoed through the crystal chandeliers, cruel and cutting. Then Vanessa moved. With a glare of contempt, she stepped toward Clara. "You pathetic woman," she hissed. "You think you matter here? You're nothing but a burden. Look at you, plain, weak, clinging to his child as if that makes you important." Before anyone could stop her, Vanessa raised her heel and kicked Clara hard in the stomach. The hall erupted in chaos. Some screamed, others rushed forward, and Clara collapsed to her knees, clutching her belly. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her face twisted in pain. "And Richard?" He laughed again. He laughed as if cruelty was entertainment, as if his pregnant wife's agony was part of the evening's performance. But then, a voice thundered across the ballroom, deep and commanding, silencing every whisper, every scream. "Enough!" The sound froze Richard's laughter in his throat. Heads turned toward the back of the hall, where a tall figure in a black suit stepped into the light. His presence was magnetic, his eyes blazing with fury. Alexander Knight, billionaire investor, had arrived. And this was only the beginning. The ballroom, moments ago a blur of laughter and whispered gossip, fell into a stunned silence. The single word, "enough," still echoed across the crystal walls, reverberating through the very bones of the guests. All eyes turned toward the entrance where Alexander Knight stood, his tall figure framed by the golden light spilling from the grand chandeliers. Alexander was no ordinary man. His name was whispered in boardrooms, his decisions could shift markets, and his fortune was so vast that magazines speculated whether he might one day buy a country. But it was not his wealth that froze the crowd tonight. It was the fury blazing in his eyes. He strode forward, every step deliberate, the polished marble beneath his shoes cracking with the force of his presence. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't even acknowledge Vanessa. His gaze was locked on Clara, still crumpled on the floor, her trembling hands clutching her swollen belly as tears streaked down her pale face. "Clara," Alexander said, his voice softer now, but carrying enough strength to reach every corner of the room. He crouched beside her, ignoring the stares, his hands steady as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" Clara's lips parted, her voice no louder than a whisper. "The baby? Alexander, the baby." Something primal flickered across his face. Fear, anger, protectiveness all tangled into one. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She felt impossibly fragile against his chest, and yet he carried her as though nothing else in the world mattered. Richard finally broke the silence with a scoff. "Put her down, Knight. She's my wife, not your business." That single word, wife, sent murmurs through the guests. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others pulled out their phones, already recording the scandal. Alexander turned slowly, still holding Clara. His jaw tightened. "Your wife? You stand there and laugh while she's assaulted, while your unborn child is put in danger? You don't deserve the word husband." Gasps echoed. Vanessa's face turned crimson with rage. She clung to Richard's arm, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. She threw herself in front of me. I barely touched her." But no one believed her. The guests had seen everything. Her cruelty had been exposed beneath the unforgiving glare of the chandeliers. Richard, however, was not ready to back down. He squared his shoulders, raising his voice to cover his fear. "You think your money gives you the right to lecture me, Knight? Clara is my responsibility. I'll decide what happens to her." Alexander's eyes darkened. "No, Richard. Tonight you lost that privilege. Tonight the world saw who you really are." He shifted his gaze across the ballroom, making sure the cameras, the journalists, the influencers, all of them heard his words. "And I promise you, this will not be forgotten." The murmur swelled into a wave of whispers. Guests leaned into one another, their eyes darting between the furious CEO and the billionaire protector. The scandal was no longer just gossip. It was history being written. Clara clung weakly to Alexander's jacket, her tears soaking into the fine fabric. She could hear her own heartbeat, the echo of her baby's fragile life inside her, and she felt a flicker of hope she thought she had lost forever. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. Alexander tightened his hold and started toward the exit. His voice, low but unyielding, cut through the noise. "I'm taking her to the hospital. Anyone who tries to stop me will regret it." No one moved, not even Richard. The great doors of the ballroom swung open as Alexander carried Clara into the night, leaving behind a room full of shattered illusions and a husband whose empire had just begun to crumble. And the real war had only just begun. The world outside the hospital windows blurred into streaks of neon and headlights as Alexander's car sped through the city. Clara, lying weakly in the back seat, closed her eyes. Every bump on the road seemed to echo the pain in her belly, but her mind drifted somewhere else. Back to a time when life felt simple. Back to a time before Richard, before betrayal, before her body carried both hope and fear. She remembered the girl she used to be. At 21, Clara Evans had been a dreamer. She grew up in a small town on the outskirts of Chicago, the daughter of a local tailor and a school teacher. Money was always tight, but the house was full of love. She spent her childhood surrounded by fabrics and sketches, watching her mother mend clothes and listening to her father's lessons about honesty and kindness. From them she inherited two things, a sharp eye for beauty and an unshakable belief that love was meant to be pure. By the time she reached college, Clara had blossomed into a young woman with talent that couldn't be ignored. She studied fashion design, her sketches often pinned to classroom boards as examples of brilliance. Professors praised her creativity, while classmates envied her natural elegance. Yet Clara never acted superior. She worked part-time in a cafe to cover expenses, laughed with her friends, and dreamed of one day owning a small boutique where women of all backgrounds could feel beautiful. It was during those years that she met Alexander Knight. He wasn't the billionaire he would later become. Back then, he was simply Alex, a tall, intense business student with an ambition that practically radiated from him. They met at a university charity project, organizing a fundraiser for underprivileged kids. Clara had volunteered to design promotional posters. Alex had volunteered to handle logistics and funding. From the very first meeting, their paths collided. She was sketching quietly at a table when he leaned over, his deep voice startling her. "That's impressive. You just made our boring event look like something people might actually want to attend." She looked up, meeting a pair of storm gray eyes. For a moment, the world tilted. Alex wasn't like the other boys on campus. He carried himself with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from vision. She blushed, muttering a shy thank you, but he only smiled, a smile that would stay etched in her memory for years. They spent weeks working side by side. Clara admired his discipline, his ability to negotiate with sponsors twice his age, and his refusal to give up on anything. He admired her creativity, her compassion, and the way she treated every child in the fundraiser as if they were her own siblings. Slowly, friendship grew into something deeper. There were long nights spent discussing dreams over coffee, accidental brushes of hands that lingered too long, and moments of silence that spoke louder than words. But fate, cruel as it often is, had other plans. Clara's family faced financial hardship after her father fell ill. Medical bills piled up, and Clara made the painful choice to focus on helping at home, rather than chasing a relationship that might complicate both their futures. She never told Alex how much he meant to her. She walked away quietly, leaving only memories behind. Years later, when she met Richard Evans, she was vulnerable. Richard was charming, polished, and ambitious. Everything that seemed safe, everything she thought she needed. She convinced herself it was love. She convinced herself this was her chance at stability, at building the family she'd always dreamed of. But tonight, as Alexander carried her out of the gala, she couldn't help but think back to the boy who had once seen her worth without needing her to prove it. The boy who had now become a man powerful enough to protect her when no one else would. Her lips trembled as she whispered into the darkness of the car, words barely audible. "Alex, why did I ever let go?" And in the silence that followed, Alexander's hand found hers, firm and reassuring, as if to say, "You won't have to let go again." While Clara lay in the hospital under Alexander's protection, the man at the center of the storm, Richard Evans, stood alone in his penthouse, staring at the glittering skyline. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, the amber liquid catching the city's neon glow. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who, on the surface, seemed untouchable. Handsome, successful, wealthy beyond imagination. But behind the polished exterior was a man built on arrogance, lies, and the kind of ambition that devoured everything in its path. Richard's story wasn't one of privilege. He had grown up in a cramped apartment above a hardware store, the son of a mechanic who worked himself to the bone, and a mother who held down 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Richard hated every moment of it. He hated the peeling paint on the walls, the smell of oil and sweat clinging to his father's clothes, the embarrassment of never having enough. Even as a boy, he swore he would never be poor again. Ambition became his religion. In college, while others partied, Richard studied the art of manipulation. He wasn't the smartest in the room, but he was the most ruthless. He knew how to flatter professors, how to charm classmates into doing his work, how to take credit for ideas that weren't his. By graduation, he had built a network of connections strong enough to open doors that talent alone never could. His rise in the corporate world was meteoric. At 28, he maneuvered himself into a struggling tech startup, promising investors he could turn it around. What no one knew was that he had falsified data, inflated projections, and convinced desperate stakeholders to gamble everything on his vision. Against all odds, or perhaps because of his cunning, he pulled it off. The company flourished, not through innovation, but through relentless cost-cutting, questionable contracts, and backroom deals. By 35, Richard was hailed as a self-made success story. Magazines put his face on their covers, calling him the new titan of tech. Investors lined up to throw money at his ventures. But those who worked closest to him knew the truth. His charm was a mask, his generosity a performance. Behind closed doors, he was cold, controlling, and cruel. That cruelty extended to his marriage. Clara had been drawn in by his polished exterior, by the promises of safety and stability he whispered into her ear. At first, he played the role of the perfect husband. Flowers, candlelit dinners, whispered vows of devotion. But once the ring was on her finger, the mask slipped. He belittled her dreams, mocking her passion for design as a hobby for bored housewives. He forbade her from working, insisting her place was at home, smiling on his arm at galas and cocktail parties. When she became pregnant, he paraded the news as though it were another trophy, another proof of his power. But behind closed doors he grew colder, more distant, and more cruel. And then came Vanessa. To Richard, she was not just a mistress, but a symbol, a living reminder that he could have anything, anyone, whenever he wanted. He flaunted her not out of love, but out of arrogance. Every smile, every touch in public was designed to humiliate Clara, to show the world that he was untouchable, even in sin. But Richard had a secret. A dangerous one. Buried in the servers of his company were files, evidence of embezzlement, shell companies, and forged financial reports. For years, he had siphoned millions through offshore accounts, carefully hidden behind layers of fake corporations. Only a handful of people even suspected the truth, and one of them was Vanessa. She wasn't with him just for wealth or power. She was with him because she had leverage. She kept recordings, documents, even photos. Richard thought he controlled her. In reality, she was his most dangerous liability. As he sipped his scotch, Richard smirked, convincing himself he still had everything under control. Clara was weak, Alexander was just a distraction, and Vanessa, well, she wouldn't dare betray him. But the cracks were already forming. And soon, the empire Richard built on lies would crumble beneath his feet. Vanessa Moore adjusted the strap of her crimson gown as she stared at her reflection in the mirror of her luxury apartment. The same dress she had worn at the gala still clung to her figure, shimmering under the soft glow of the lights. To anyone else, she looked like perfection, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and own it. But behind her flawless smile was a mind sharper than any blade, and a hunger that no amount of champagne or diamonds could satisfy. Vanessa hadn't grown up in luxury. She was the daughter of a single mother, raised in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. From an early age, Vanessa learned two things: beauty opened doors, and ambition kept them from slamming shut. By 20, she had already left that town behind, determined never to return as the girl people pitied. She promised herself that she would never settle for less than everything. Richard Evans was not her first conquest, but he was her most valuable. When she first joined Evans Technologies as a public relations manager, she saw the opportunity immediately. Richard was powerful, arrogant, and bored. He had the kind of ego that craved validation and the kind of weakness that fell easily to flattery. Vanessa played her part perfectly, laughing at his jokes, listening to his rants, making him feel like the center of the universe. It didn't take long before she was more than just his employee. But unlike other women who might have been content with jewelry, designer bags, or weekend trips to Paris, Vanessa wanted more. Much more. She didn't just want Richard's affection, she wanted his power, his company, and his name. And she was patient. While Richard believed he was the one in control, Vanessa was collecting leverage piece by piece. Late-night conversations secretly recorded on her phone, financial documents carelessly left open on his laptop, quickly photographed before he noticed, emails forwarded to a hidden account only she could access. Each scrap of information was another card in the deck she was building. She knew about the offshore accounts. She knew about the falsified reports. She even knew about the board members Richard had bribed to secure his position. At first it had terrified her, but soon she realized the power in her hands. If Richard ever betrayed her, or if Clara somehow regained her place, Vanessa could destroy him with a single file. And yet she wasn't ready to burn it all down. Not yet, because Vanessa was playing a longer game. The gala had been a test. She had humiliated Clara not just for her own amusement, but to see how far Richard would go to protect her. When he laughed instead of defending his wife, Vanessa felt triumphant. It confirmed what she already knew. Richard was hers to control. But Alexander Knight's sudden appearance unsettled her. She hadn't anticipated him stepping into the picture, and the way he looked at Clara, like she was someone precious, someone untouchable, sparked a flash of jealousy that Vanessa couldn't ignore. For the first time, Vanessa sensed that she might not be the most dangerous player in the room. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, overlooking the glittering skyline. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Richard. "We need to meet. Tonight." Vanessa smirked. Of course he needed her. He always did. But what Richard didn't realize was that every desperate message, every whispered secret, only tied him tighter into her web. She lifted her glass in a mock toast to the city. "Here's to the empire I'm about to own," she whispered to herself. Because Vanessa wasn't just the mistress. She was the storm that would decide whether Richard rose higher or finally fell. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the monitor tracking Clara's heartbeat. She lay against the white sheets, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Her eyes were open but distant, staring at the ceiling as memories swirled like storm clouds in her mind. For weeks, months really, her life had been a cage. At home, the Evans penthouse was a monument to wealth. Glass walls, designer furniture, priceless artwork. But for Clara, it had never felt like home. It was a museum, cold and silent, where her laughter once tried to echo but was always swallowed by Richard's disdain. She remembered nights when she waited by the window, a warm dinner growing cold on the table. Richard would stumble in after midnight, smelling of whiskey and perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked gentle questions, "Where were you? Why didn't you call?" he brushed her off with a smirk. Sometimes he patted her head like a child, other times he barked at her to stop being paranoid. And Clara, desperate to keep the peace, stayed quiet. But silence came with a cost. Richard's family was no better. His mother, a sharp-tongued woman who worshipped her son, often visited. She looked at Clara with thinly veiled contempt, as if she were nothing more than a pretty ornament. "You should be grateful," she would say. "Richard saved you from a small-town life. Remember your place." Even worse were the whispers from the staff. Clara saw the way they exchanged glances when Richard brought Vanessa to the apartment under the excuse of business meetings. The maids kept their heads down, but their silence was its own betrayal. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. And no one stood for her. The humiliation wasn't just private, it was public. At dinners with investors, Clara sat quietly at Richard's side, ignored, except when she was asked about the baby. Richard would laugh and joke with Vanessa across the table, as if daring her to react. Once, Clara had excused herself to the restroom, her hands trembling as she locked the stall door, tears slipping down her cheeks. She pressed a hand over her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Loneliness became her constant companion. The woman who once dreamed of designing gowns for the world now found herself trapped in designer gowns she didn't choose, paraded like a trophy wife. Her sketchbooks gathered dust in the corner of her closet. Richard had called her art a waste of time and thrown one of her designs into the fireplace. She had stood there, frozen, as the paper curled and blackened. That was the night she stopped drawing. But the deepest betrayal wasn't Richard's infidelity, or his cruelty, or even Vanessa's existence. It was the moment Clara realized she had been erased. The world saw her only as Richard's wife, and even Richard saw her only as a burden. And yet, she endured. Because every time she thought of giving up, she felt the soft flutter of life inside her. Every heartbeat, every kick, reminded her she wasn't just living for herself anymore. She whispered to her baby in the quiet of the night, promising a better life, promising to protect them even if it cost her everything. But promises are fragile when made by a woman who feels utterly alone. As Clara lay in the hospital, the memory of Vanessa's kick replayed over and over, a cruel reminder of how powerless she had been. But beneath the pain, something stirred. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was resolve. A seed of strength buried deep, waiting to grow. Because Clara knew one thing. Silence had almost destroyed her, and silence could no longer be her answer. The sirens wailed through the night, their haunting cry cutting across the city as the ambulance sped toward Lenox Memorial Hospital. Inside, Clara lay strapped to a stretcher, her face pale as chalk, her breath shallow. One hand clutched her belly, the other trembling as it gripped Alexander's hand. He sat beside her, refusing to let go, his eyes never leaving her. "Stay with me, Clara," he whispered, his voice rough with fear. "Stay strong for the baby." Clara tried to smile, but her lips quivered. "I can't lose this child, Alex. It's all I have left." Her words tore at him. He had seen countless business deals collapse, fortunes vanish, and empires crumble, but nothing had ever shaken him like this moment. The thought of Clara, fragile and broken, fighting not only for her life, but for the tiny heartbeat inside her. The paramedic called out, "Blood pressure dropping. We need to move fast." Within minutes, the ambulance screeched to a halt, and Clara was rushed through the hospital's sliding glass doors. Nurses swarmed her, pushing the gurney down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Alexander followed, his long strides matching their hurried pace. Inside the emergency room, doctors worked quickly, checking vitals, preparing an ultrasound. Alexander stood outside the glass wall, his fists clenched. He wasn't used to waiting. He was used to commanding, to controlling, to bending the world to his will. But now he could do nothing but watch as the woman he once knew, the woman he had never stopped caring for, fought to hold on. Finally, a doctor stepped out. "Mr. Knight?" Alexander turned sharply. "How is she? How's the baby?" The doctor's expression was serious but calm. "It's complicated. The baby's heartbeat is still strong, but the mother is under severe stress. She needs rest, care, and zero emotional strain. If she experiences another shock like tonight, both lives could be in danger." Alexander's jaw tightened. "She won't go through that again. I'll make sure of it." The doctor gave a curt nod before returning inside. Alexander pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He watched Clara, lying there so small, so fragile, and swore silently that Richard would never hurt her again. But outside the hospital, the story had already begun to spread. The gala had been filled with the city's most powerful and most gossip-hungry. Phones had recorded everything. Vanessa's cruel words, her vicious kick, Richard's mocking laughter, and Alexander's thunderous entrance. By midnight, the video was viral. News outlets plastered headlines across their sites. CEO's Mistress attacks pregnant wife at gala. Richard Evans laughs while wife suffers. Billionaire Knight steps in, hero or rival. The world that once admired Richard now turned on him with a vengeance. Investors began calling his office, demanding explanations. Board members whispered about emergency meetings. His PR team scrambled, but no spin could erase the image of a husband laughing while his pregnant wife collapsed in agony. Inside the hospital, Clara stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, the bright lights stinging. Beside her, Alexander sat in a chair, his suit rumpled, his face weary but determined. He leaned forward the second he saw her eyes open. "You're safe now," he said softly. "The baby's safe." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why are you here, Alex? Why do you still care after all these years?" He reached for her hand, his voice low but steady. "Because I should have never let you go, and because no one hurts you while I'm alive." In that moment, Clara's heart trembled. For the first time in months, she felt more than fear. She felt the faintest spark of hope. But outside those hospital walls, Richard was already plotting, and Vanessa was sharpening her knives. The storm was only beginning. By dawn, the hospital was surrounded. Reporters, photographers, and camera crews crowded the entrance, their flashes popping like fireworks each time a nurse stepped outside. The gala scandal had spread like wildfire overnight, and the world wanted answers. Inside Clara's private suite, Alexander Knight stood at the window, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls from journalists, board members, and political contacts, all demanding his statement. He ignored most of them. His priority was the woman resting on the bed behind him. Clara lay asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. For the first time since the incident, a touch of peace softened her features. Alexander's gaze lingered on her, before he turned back to face reality. He knew what he had to do. Richard was already on the defensive. Overnight, his PR team had issued a statement claiming the incident was exaggerated, that Vanessa had simply tripped, and that Clara had overreacted. But the videos told a different story. Millions had seen Vanessa's deliberate kick, Richard's mocking laughter, and Alexander's furious entrance. The narrative wasn't Richard's to control anymore. At 9 o'clock sharp, Alexander walked out of the hospital, flanked by 2 of his security guards. The crowd erupted instantly, microphones shoved forward, voices shouting questions. "Mr. Knight, are you having an affair with Clara Evans? Did you assault Richard Evans at the gala? Are you planning to sue Evans Technologies?" Alexander raised a hand, and the noise dimmed. His voice, deep and steady, carried easily over the chaos. "Clara Evans is not just Richard's wife. She is a woman, a mother-to-be, and a human being who was brutally humiliated in front of the entire city. She was assaulted while carrying a child, and the man who should have protected her chose to laugh." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing every word. Alexander continued, his tone sharper now. "I will not allow her to be silenced. I will not allow lies to cover what the world saw with its own eyes. And I promise you, justice will be done. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now." The press exploded, their shouts rising into a frenzy, but Alexander turned and strode back inside. His message had been delivered. The world now knew he wasn't just Clara's friend, he was her shield. Back in the suite, Clara had woken just in time to see the live broadcast on the television mounted to the wall. She covered her mouth with trembling hands as she watched Alexander defend her, not with whispers or private comfort, but with a public declaration powerful enough to shake the city. Tears blurred her vision. No one had stood for her in so long, not Richard, not his family, not even her so-called friends in high society. And now, here was Alexander, risking his own reputation to give her back her dignity. "Why?" she whispered when he returned. "Why would you do this for me?" Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable but his voice steady. "Because the world needs to see the truth, and because you deserve more than silence." Outside, the consequences were already unraveling. Investors began withdrawing from Evans Technologies. Stocks plummeted by 15% in a single morning. Board members whispered about removing Richard as CEO. Meanwhile, Vanessa's face was splashed across every tabloid, her reputation shredded as the mistress who attacked a pregnant wife. But Richard wasn't beaten yet. In his penthouse office, rage boiled inside him as he watched Alexander's speech replay across every network. He slammed a glass against the wall, shards scattering like his crumbling empire. "If Knight wants war," he growled to Vanessa, "then war is what he'll get." And so the battle lines were drawn. Love against arrogance, truth against lies, a billionaire against a CEO whose downfall was only beginning. Richard Evans had built his empire on control, and losing it was something he could not stomach. For 2 days, his name had dominated headlines, not as a visionary CEO, but as the husband who laughed while his pregnant wife was assaulted. Investors fled. His board was restless. His phone buzzed with messages from politicians distancing themselves from him. Richard paced his office, his anger radiating like heat. Vanessa lounged on the leather sofa, swirling red wine in her glass. Her crimson nails tapped the glass lazily as she watched him unravel. "You're finished if you don't fight back," she purred. Richard stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I'll fight back." Clara thinks she can humiliate me, hiding behind night. But she's still my wife. I know her weaknesses, and I'll make the world see her as the liar she is. He called his PR team into an emergency meeting. Their strategy was ruthless: smear Clara's name before Alexander could elevate it further. Within hours, tabloids released exclusive leaks about Clara, stories claiming she had grown close to Alexander long before the gala, implying that her marriage had been a sham for years. Anonymous sources whispered about staged tears, a manipulative wife using pregnancy as a shield while chasing the billionaire's fortune. On talk shows, commentators debated whether Clara had played the victim. Carefully edited footage made it seem as though she had provoked Vanessa. A few paid experts questioned her health, suggesting her fainting spells had been exaggerated for sympathy. The cruelty was staggering, and it worked, for a moment. Social media became a battlefield. Some defended Clara, but others echoed Richard's lies, calling her a gold digger, a schemer, a weak woman using motherhood as her only value. Richard smirked as he watched the headlines shift. See, it's working. By next week, she'll be yesterday's pity story. But Vanessa wasn't convinced. She set down her glass and crossed her legs, her tone sharp. You're forgetting one thing, Richard. The internet never forgets. Those videos of you laughing, they're everywhere. No smear campaign can erase that. Richard turned on her, his voice like venom. Then we make people forget her instead. You, Vanessa, you'll be the weapon. The loyal mistress turned fiancée. We'll announce our engagement, make it look like I've moved on from a toxic wife to a woman who truly supports me. We'll control the story. Vanessa arched a brow. Part of her thrilled at the thought of stepping into the spotlight, of finally being more than the other woman. But another part whispered caution. Richard was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Still, she smiled. Fine, announce it. But remember, Richard, I'm not just your weapon. I'm your insurance. You cross me, and those files I keep, they'll bury you. Richard's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. We're on the same side, darling. For now. By evening, press releases flooded inboxes across the city. Richard Evans confirms engagement to Vanessa Moore amid divorce proceedings. Photos were staged, Vanessa flashing a diamond ring, Richard's hand on her waist, both smiling as though scandal had never touched them. The move shocked the public. Some saw it as brazen arrogance, others as proof that Richard had no shame. But the announcement achieved its goal. It shifted attention. Clara, recovering quietly in the hospital, was once again painted as the discarded wife, the outsider in her own story. But what Richard underestimated was the power of truth. Clara's silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was preparation. And Alexander wasn't about to let Richard rewrite history without a fight. Because if Richard thought this smear campaign was the war, he hadn't seen the battle that was coming. The hospital room was quiet again, too quiet. The flowers sent by well-wishers had begun to wilt in their vases, their fragrance replaced by the sterile bite of disinfectant. Clara sat by the window in a hospital gown, her hair unbrushed, her hands folded protectively over her belly. She hadn't spoken much in days. On the television mounted to the wall, Richard's smug face appeared once more. This time he stood beside Vanessa, her hand flaunting a massive diamond ring. Their smiles were blinding, their headlines cruel. Richard Evans, engaged to Vanessa Moore, moving on from toxic marriage. The words cut deeper than any knife. Clara fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off, but the silence that followed was worse. In the stillness, the whispers of the world rang louder. She's weak. She's discarded. She's nothing without him. Clara pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed and broken. She barely recognized herself anymore. The vibrant girl who once dreamed of designing gowns, the woman who once believed in love. Now she was just the wife who had been laughed at, humiliated, replaced. Maybe they're right, she whispered to the empty room. Maybe I am nothing. The thought terrified her, but it wrapped around her like chains. She had given up her career, her independence, her voice, all for Richard. And now, what did she have left? A ruined reputation, a broken heart, a world that pitied her or mocked her. Her sobs shook her body. She slid down onto the floor, clutching her belly, whispering apologies to the child who had no choice in any of this. I'm sorry, she cried. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. The despair threatened to drown her. She thought of disappearing, of fading into the background so that the cruel eyes of the world would stop watching her fall apart. But then, a sound broke through her despair. A steady, rhythmic thump, faint at first, then stronger. It was the monitor beside her bed, still tracking the baby's heartbeat. Clara froze. She lifted her head, listening. Thump, 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 thump. Strong. Steady. Defiant. Her tears didn't stop, but they changed. They weren't just tears of sorrow now. They were tears of realization. Her baby was alive. Her baby was fighting. Her baby believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. Clara crawled back onto the bed, her hands covering her belly as if to shield the life within. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're still holding on. If you can fight, then so can I." For the first time in weeks, something shifted inside her. The weight of despair didn't vanish, but a spark lit within the darkness. She thought of Alexander, of how he had carried her from the gala, how he had faced the press to protect her when no one else had. She thought of her parents, who had raised her to believe that dignity was worth more than diamonds. And she thought of herself, not the broken woman in the mirror, but the girl who once believed she could create beauty from nothing but fabric and thread. Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Her voice was stronger now. "I won't let him win. Not Richard. Not Vanessa. They don't get to write my story. I do." The baby's heartbeat pulsed steadily, as if in agreement. And in that fragile hospital room, for the first time since her world collapsed, Clara rose from the ashes of despair with a new vow. She would fight. Not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. The hospital released Clara a week later. She returned not to the Evans penthouse, but to a quiet townhouse Alexander had secured for her under his name. It was simple, private, safe. A place where reporters couldn't swarm the doors, and Richard couldn't barge in pretending to claim what he had already discarded. Still, Clara felt uneasy. Each night she lay awake. The headlines were playing in her mind, Richard's laughter echoing like poison. She knew the smear campaign wasn't over. He wouldn't stop until he crushed her completely. One rainy afternoon, while unpacking a box of old belongings, Clara stumbled across something she hadn't seen in months. An external hard drive. It was small, silver, and scratched at the edges. She remembered Richard tossing it carelessly into her bag months ago after a board meeting, telling her to keep it somewhere safe. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Richard often dumped things on her, treating her like an assistant rather than a wife. Now, her curiosity piqued. She plugged it into her laptop, expecting to find boring corporate files she wouldn't understand. But as the folders opened, her breath caught in her throat. Dozens of documents filled the screen, financial spreadsheets, offshore account numbers, emails with shadowy contacts. Clara clicked through them, her hands trembling. Each file told the same story. Richard had been embezzling millions, siphoning company money into shell corporations across the world. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just greed. This was criminal. Scrolling further, Clara found audio recordings. Vanessa's voice, sly and taunting, coaxing Richard in admitting his schemes. "Don't worry," Vanessa purred in one clip. "No one will ever find out. I'll keep your secret safe, as long as I'm by your side." Clara's stomach churned. Vanessa wasn't just his mistress. She was his accomplice, his blackmailer, his ticking time bomb. She pushed the laptop away, her heart racing. She should call the police. She should send everything to the board. But then fear gripped her. Richard was ruthless. If he discovered she had these files, he wouldn't hesitate to silence her, by any means. Her first instinct was to close it all, pretend she hadn't seen it. But then she thought of the baby. The baby who had given her strength when she was ready to give up. Could she really raise her child in a world where Richard still held power, where his lies went unpunished? Her hand rested on her belly. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore." Just then the doorbell rang. Clara froze, panic flooding her chest. She quickly shut the laptop and tucked the hard drive beneath the cushions of the couch before answering. It was Alexander. His suit was damp from the rain, his expression sharp as always, but his eyes softened when they met hers. "You look pale. What happened?" Clara hesitated. For a moment she considered hiding the truth. But Alexander had already risked everything to protect her. He deserved to know. "I found something," she whispered, leading him to the couch. She pulled out the hard drive, her hands trembling. Richard's secrets, his crimes, proof of everything. Alexander's eyes narrowed as he scanned the files on her laptop. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara saw the ruthless businessman beneath the protector, the man capable of taking down empires. "This," he said slowly, "isn't just leverage. This is a weapon. With this, Richard's empire will collapse, and for the first time, he'll be the one begging for mercy." Clara's pulse quickened. She felt both fear and relief, fear of what Richard might do if he discovered she had the files, but relief that, finally, she had power. For months, she had been silent, powerless, erased. Now, in her hands, she held the key to her own redemption and Richard's destruction. Clara stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection she barely recognized. For months she had seen nothing but a ghost. Hollow eyes, slumped shoulders, a woman broken by betrayal. But now, something was changing. Slowly, painfully, she was rediscovering the woman she once was. The woman Richard had tried to erase. It started with the files. Holding Richard's secrets had given her more than evidence. It had given her power. For the first time since their marriage, Clara wasn't helpless. She wasn't the one being humiliated. She held the weapon that could bring him to his knees. And that realization awakened something deep inside her. Alexander noticed the shift immediately. He had been sitting at the dining table, reviewing the documents with a team of private investigators he trusted. But when Clara walked into the room, he looked up and froze. She wasn't wearing the oversized sweater she had hidden in for weeks. She wasn't curling inward like someone ashamed of existing. Instead, she wore a sleek navy dress that hugged her growing belly with dignity rather than shame. Her hair, freshly cut and styled, framed her face in soft waves. And her eyes, God, her eyes, were no longer dull. They burned with quiet fire. "You look," Alexander began, searching for the right word. "Like yourself again?" Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Not like myself, Alex. Better." The makeover hadn't been about vanity. It was about reclaiming her identity. She had called her old college friend, a stylist who owed her a favor, and asked for help. Together, they had gone through racks of clothing until Clara found pieces that made her feel strong. Every hemline, every fabric was chosen not to please Richard. Not to fit into his world, but to reflect the woman she wanted to be. As the stylist pinned the final dress, Clara had looked into the mirror and whispered, "I am not his victim. I am my child's mother. I am me." Now she sat with Alexander and the investigators, listening carefully as they outlined strategies for how the files could be used. She took notes, asked questions, and made decisions. Gone was the silent wife who nodded while her husband spoke. In her place was a woman who demanded to be heard. Alexander watched her, admiration flickering in his gaze. This was the Clara he remembered from college, the one who had sketched designs late into the night, who believed she could change the world with a needle and thread. But now, she was sharper, stronger, forged by fire and betrayal. "We can't release the files yet," Clara said firmly. "If we do, Richard will claim I'm vengeful, unstable. We need timing. We need impact. I want the truth revealed in front of everyone who ever doubted me." Alexander nodded. "The gala next month. The Children's Future Foundation. Richard is sponsoring it. The entire board, the press, investors, they'll all be there." Clara's heart pounded. The same kind of event where her humiliation had begun could now become the stage for her redemption. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "That's where it ends." Later that night, when the house grew quiet, Clara sat alone in her room, sketchbook in hand. For the first time in years, she picked up a pencil and began to draw. The lines were shaky at first, but soon they flowed, forming the silhouette of a gown, her gown. She imagined herself walking into that gala not as Richard's discarded wife, but as Clara Evans, powerful, unbroken, unstoppable. She closed the sketchbook, her hand resting on her belly. "We're going to show them," she whispered to her baby. "We're going to show them who we really are." And as the city slept, Clara Evans was reborn. The night of the Children's Future Foundation Gala arrived like a storm. The Grand Imperial Hotel, the very place where Clara's humiliation had unfolded weeks earlier, glowed with chandeliers and velvet carpets once more. Limousines lined the entrance, flashing cameras capturing the city's most powerful as they stepped onto the red carpet. For many, it was just another glamorous evening. But for Clara, it was the battleground where she would reclaim her dignity. Inside one of the waiting cars, Clara took a deep breath. She smoothed the silk of her gown, the very design she had sketched during those sleepless nights. Midnight blue, with hand-embroidered silver details that shimmered like constellations, the gown hugged her form and celebrated her pregnancy rather than concealing it. She was no longer hiding. She was radiant, commanding, undeniable. Alexander sat beside her, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that made his presence even more formidable. He glanced at her, and for a moment, the ruthless billionaire softened. "Are you ready?" Clara met his gaze, her lips curving into a confident smile. "More than ready." When the car door opened, the flashes erupted like fireworks. Reporters gasped as Clara stepped out, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. She walked with the grace of a queen returning to her throne, every step deliberate, every movement defiant. Gasps turned to murmurs, then to applause. "Is that Clara Evans?" one reporter whispered. "She looks incredible," another replied. "And with Alexander Knight? My God, the headlines write themselves." The entrance became chaos as journalists scrambled for photos. Clara kept her chin high, refusing to be cowed. For the first time, she wasn't walking into a gala as Richard's accessory. She was walking in as herself, and the entire city could feel it. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Richard and Vanessa had arrived earlier, smug and confident, Vanessa flaunting her engagement ring like a crown jewel. But when Clara and Alexander entered, the room tilted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, every eye turned toward her. Richard's face drained of color. He gripped his champagne flute so tightly it cracked, spilling liquid down his cuff. Vanessa's smile faltered, jealousy flashing in her eyes as she saw the crowd gravitate toward Clara. Clara didn't falter. She walked past them, her gown sweeping like a wave of power, her eyes steady and calm. She didn't need to shout. Her presence was enough to silence every doubt, every cruel word that had ever been spoken about her. Alexander leaned close, his voice low but firm. "They can't touch you anymore." The whispers in the room grew louder. Guests who had once pitied her now looked at her with awe. Even those who had sided with Richard shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had underestimated the woman he had cast aside. At the center of the ballroom, Clara paused. The chandeliers above seemed to spotlight her, casting her in a glow that made her look untouchable. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly, applause began. First from a small group of women near the stage, then spreading like wildfire until the entire ballroom thundered with clapping. Richard's jaw clenched. Vanessa's hand dug into his arm. And Clara? She smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of triumph. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was winning. But the night was far from over, because buried deep in her clutch was the hard drive, the weapon that would expose Richard's empire of lies. And when the moment came, she was ready to strike. The gala pulsed with tension as Clara and Alexander took their seats near the front, directly across from Richard and Vanessa. The air between the two couples crackled like a live wire. Guests whispered, cell phones flashed, and the orchestra's elegant music could barely mask the undercurrent of anticipation. Richard leaned toward Vanessa, his jaw tight, his voice low. "Don't react. Don't give her the satisfaction." But Vanessa was seething. Her crimson lips curled into a bitter smile as she watched Clara laugh softly at something Alexander whispered. The sight of Clara glowing, confident, adored by the crowd, was unbearable. For weeks, Vanessa had been the queen, Richard's chosen one, the woman in the spotlight. Now, in an instant, Clara had stolen it all back. When the dinner ended and the speeches began, the tension reached its breaking point. A guest at their table asked an innocent question, a simple remark about the rumors swirling around Richard's company. Vanessa's eyes glittered with malicious pride. She had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, please," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the table. "If they only knew half of what Richard has pulled off to keep that company afloat." The room quieted instantly. Dozens of heads turned, ears straining. Richard froze, his hand tightening around his wine glass. "Vanessa," he hissed under his breath, "shut up." But Vanessa, intoxicated by jealousy and champagne, smirked. "What? It's not a secret. Everyone knows rich men bend the rules. Offshore accounts, falsified numbers. It's how empires are built. Isn't that right, darling?" The word offshore landed like a grenade. A murmur swept through the ballroom. Phones began recording. Cameras zoomed in. Guests leaned forward, their faces lit with scandal-hungry curiosity. Clara's heart pounded. She sat perfectly still, but inside, adrenaline surged. Vanessa had just confirmed what the files on the hard drive already proved. The difference was that now the world had heard it, in Vanessa's own careless words. Richard's face turned red with fury. He grabbed Vanessa's arm hard enough to make her gasp. "Not another word," he snapped. But it was too late. Alexander stood, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "You all heard her. Vanessa Moore, Richard Evans's mistress and now fiancée, has just admitted to illegal activities within Evans Technologies, offshore accounts, falsified numbers." He turned to the audience, his presence commanding. "This is no longer a rumor. This is testimony." The room erupted. Journalists scrambled to text their editors. Investors whispered furiously to one another. Richard tried to rise, shouting over the chaos, but his voice was drowned out. Vanessa, realizing what she had done, turned pale. "I didn't mean," she stammered. But the damage was irreversible. Her ambition, her arrogance had slipped into recklessness. Clara rose slowly, her gown shimmering under the chandeliers. She placed her hand gently on her belly before stepping forward, her voice clear, calm, and steady. "This is the man who mocked me, who abandoned his family, who laughed while I was attacked. And now, you see what kind of leader he truly is. His lies are not just personal, they're professional. They endanger every investor, every employee, every family tied to Evans Technologies." Her words silenced the chaos. For a moment, the entire ballroom hung on her voice. Richard lunged forward, his mask finally breaking, his face twisted with desperation. "She's lying. She's bitter, jealous. But Vanessa, trembling and half-drunk, cut him off. "No, Richard, she's not lying." The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Gasps swept the room. Richard staggered back, his empire collapsing not with a bang, but with a single slip of the tongue from the woman he thought he controlled. And Clara, for the first time, felt the weight of justice tipping in her favor. The ballroom was chaos. Vanessa's drunken slip still hung heavy in the air, every guest buzzing, phones recording, flashes of cameras like lightning. Richard's face was pale with fury, his mask of control shattered. He tried to shout over the noise, but his words were drowned by the crowd. Clara stood tall in the center of it all, her midnight blue gown glimmering beneath the chandeliers. For the first time, she wasn't trembling. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking under his shadow. Tonight, she held the power. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small silver hard drive. The very one Richard had carelessly tossed at her months ago, never imagining it would become the sword of his downfall. She held it high for all to see. "Vanessa's words are not hearsay," Clara said, her voice strong and clear, amplified by the silence that fell over the ballroom. "I have proof. Proof of every crime Richard Evans has committed. The offshore accounts, the falsified reports, the embezzlement." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several investors rose from their seats, their faces dark with anger and betrayal. Board members exchanged panicked glances. The press surged forward, hungry for every word. Richard lunged toward her, his voice raw. "Clara, stop this. You don't know what you're doing." But Alexander stepped between them, his broad frame a shield. His voice thundered across the hall. "No, Richard, for years you've silenced her. Tonight she speaks." Clara connected the hard drive to the projector set up for the gala presentations. Screens around the ballroom flickered, then lit up with files, spreadsheets of missing funds, bank transfers to secret accounts, email chains filled with incriminating evidence. Every guest watched, horrified, as the truth poured out in cold, undeniable numbers. A hush fell over the room as one email appeared. Richard's own words glowing on the giant screen. "Move the money before the auditors arrive. Make sure Clara never finds out." Clara's voice cracked, but did not falter. "You mocked me, Richard. You tried to erase me, but I was never weak. I was never blind. And now, everyone sees who you really are." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Investors shouted, some storming out in disgust. Journalists scrambled to capture every frame. Richard's board members whispered furiously, already planning his removal. Richard stumbled back, his hands shaking, sweat dripping down his temple. This is all taken out of context. She's twisting it, Clara. Think of the baby." At the mention of their child, Clara's eyes hardened. "Don't you dare. You lost the right to use our baby as an excuse the moment you laughed at my pain." Her words cut deeper than any knife. The crowd turned on him completely. Where once Richard had been the golden boy of Wall Street, now he was a pariah, his empire collapsing in real time. Security guards, once loyal to his paycheck, stepped forward at Alexander's signal. Vanessa sat frozen, her face pale, realizing she had sealed both their fates. For all her scheming, she had become the spark that lit Richard's downfall. As Richard was escorted out, shouting curses, Clara felt her knees weaken. But Alexander caught her before she could fall. The room, still buzzing with scandal, now turned its gaze on her. Not with pity, but with awe. She had done it. She had exposed him. For the first time, Clara wasn't just Richard Evans's wife. She was Clara Evans, the woman who brought a titan to his knees. The morning after the gala, the headlines were merciless. Richard Evans exposed, financial crimes uncovered at gala. Pregnant wife's courage brings down tech titan. Vanessa Moore confirms Evans's crimes in stunning slip. News channels replayed the footage of Clara standing tall, unveiling the files for the world to see. The once revered CEO had become a spectacle of disgrace. Inside the Evans Technologies headquarters, board members gathered in a tense emergency meeting. The atmosphere was suffocating. Men and women who had once bowed to Richard's every demand now whispered in corners, shaking their heads. Richard stormed in, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "I built this company. None of you would be here without me. You think you can throw me out because of a few doctored files?" The chairman, a gray-haired veteran who had defended Richard for years, cleared his throat. His voice was firm but heavy with finality. "It's not a few files, Richard. It's evidence. And the SEC is already investigating. Investors are pulling out. Our stock dropped 30% overnight. If you stay, this company dies." The vote was swift, brutal, and unanimous. Richard Evans was removed as CEO. He left the boardroom pale and trembling, his empire slipping through his fingers. The cameras waiting outside captured his downfall. Once the darling of Wall Street, now a disgraced man shoving past reporters, muttering threats under his breath. Back at his penthouse, Richard slammed the door shut, rage boiling inside him. "I'll rebuild," he growled. "They can't do this to me. I'll come back stronger." But when he turned, Vanessa was already packing her bags. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Vanessa didn't even look at him. "Leaving." She zipped her designer suitcase and straightened. "Do you really think I'm going down with you? You're finished, Richard. Your name is poison. I'm not ruining my life for a man who can't even keep his secret safe." Richard's jaw clenched. "You said you loved me." Vanessa laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "I loved what you gave me, but you don't have anything left to give." She brushed past him, heels clicking against the marble floor. At the door she turned, her smile cruel. "You thought you controlled me, but you were just a stepping stone. Goodbye, Richard." The slam of the door echoed like a gunshot. Alone, Richard poured himself another drink, his hands shaking. He barely noticed the knock at the door until it grew louder, sharper. Irritated, he stumbled to open it, only to be greeted by 2 federal agents flashing their badges. "Richard Evans, you're under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. You'll need to come with us." Richard's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. "You can't do this," he stammered. "I'm Richard Evans. I have lawyers. I have power." But the agents didn't flinch. They recited his rights as they led him away, his protests growing weaker with each step. Outside, cameras flashed again, capturing the once mighty CEO being escorted out of his own building in handcuffs. For Clara, watching the broadcast from Alexander's townhouse, the moment was surreal. She had imagined this day in whispers, in desperate prayers, but to see it play out so publicly was overwhelming. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering softly, "It's over. He can't hurt us anymore." And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Because while Richard's empire had collapsed, Clara's journey was just starting. A journey not of survival, but of rebirth. The world had witnessed Richard Evans's downfall in real time. Footage of his arrest dominated every channel, his once pristine image forever tarnished. But while Richard's empire crumbled, another story rose from the ashes, a story of a woman who refused to be silenced. Clara Evans. For the first time in her life, her name was on headlines not as Richard's wife or the disgraced CEO's spouse, but as the woman who had exposed corruption with courage and dignity. Clara Evans, from humiliated wife to heroine of justice. Pregnant woman brings down tech titan. Symbol of strength, Clara Evans inspires millions. The coverage was relentless, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was admiring, respectful, even reverent. Talk shows debated her resilience. Women across the country wrote letters, thanking her for showing that silence was not weakness. Social media flooded with hashtags, "Stand like Clara," "Strength and Grace," "Her voice matters." At first, Clara was overwhelmed. Sitting in Alexander's townhouse, she scrolled through the endless articles and posts, her hand trembling. For so long, every headline had been a dagger aimed at her heart. Now, they felt like balm, healing wounds she had thought would never close. Alexander entered the room, carrying tea. "The world's finally seen you the way I always did," he said softly. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes misting. "It feels strange. I don't know if I deserve all of this." Alexander knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You earned every bit of it. You fought when no one thought you could. You stood when he wanted you to crawl. Clara, you didn't just save yourself, you gave hope to every woman who's ever been silenced." His words settled deep in her heart. For so long, she had defined herself by Richard's cruelty, by the humiliation she endured. But now, she was being defined by her courage, by her strength, by her refusal to break. That evening, Clara received an invitation from a major women's rights organization. They wanted her to speak at their annual summit. She hesitated, nerves twisting in her stomach. Speaking publicly had never been her role. She had always been the quiet one, the shadow behind Richard's spotlight. But Alexander placed the invitation gently in her lap. "You don't have to do it," he said. "But if you do, your voice could change lives." Clara looked down at her belly, feeling the soft flutter of life within. Her baby, her reason, her anchor. She straightened her shoulders. "I'll do it." The summit was held in a grand auditorium, filled with thousands of women from every background. Students, professionals, mothers, survivors. When Clara stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, her expression serene yet strong. For a moment she froze. The weight of so many eyes pressed down on her. Then she thought of Richard's laughter, of Vanessa's kick, of the countless nights she had cried alone, and she thought of the heartbeat that had given her strength. Her voice, though soft at first, grew stronger with every word. "For years, I believed silence was survival. I believed that if I stayed quiet, I could keep my family, my dignity, my place. But silence nearly destroyed me. What saved me was remembering that I was not just a wife, not just a victim. I was a woman, a mother, a human being who deserved respect. The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Clara's own eyes blurred, but she smiled. That night, as she stepped off the stage, reporters didn't swarm her. Instead, women reached out their hands, not for autographs, but for solidarity, for gratitude, for hope. Clara Evans had become more than a name in the headlines. She had become a symbol, and for the first time, she felt worthy of it. The applause from the summit still echoed in Clara's mind hours later. She sat in the quiet of Alexander's townhouse, the soft hum of the city outside muted by thick glass windows. Her white dress had been carefully folded away, and she now wore a simple sweater, her hair loose, her makeup washed off. For once, she didn't feel the need to hide behind appearances. Alexander entered the room carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. He set one gently on the coffee table before sitting beside her. His jacket was gone, his tie loosened. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire the world knew, and more like the boy she had once met in college. The boy who had looked at her sketches as if they were masterpieces. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said softly. "The way you spoke, you moved them all. You moved me." Clara lowered her eyes, embarrassed but touched. "I wasn't sure I could do it." "My knees were shaking the whole time," he smiled. "No one noticed. They only saw your strength." Silence settled between them, comfortable yet heavy with unspoken memories. Clara traced her fingers along the rim of her teacup, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever think about the past, Alex? About what we could have been?" Alexander's gaze deepened. "Every day." Her breath caught. She looked up, meeting his storm-gray eyes. They held no judgment, only sincerity, and something else, something that made her heart ache. "I should have told you back then," Alexander continued, "how much you meant to me. But you disappeared. One day you were there, and the next, you were gone. And I told myself it wasn't meant to be." Clara swallowed hard. "My father got sick. My family needed me. I couldn't complicate things by falling in love when everything was falling apart, so I walked away." His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "You didn't just walk away, Clara. You took a piece of me with you." Tears pricked her eyes. She hadn't expected his words to hit so deeply. For years, she had convinced herself that what they shared had been fleeting, nothing more than youthful dreams. But hearing him now, she realized it had been real. "And then Richard came," she whispered bitterly. "He promised me security, stability. I thought I was choosing wisely. Instead, I lost myself." Alexander reached for her hand, his touch steady, grounding. "You didn't lose yourself. You were buried under his cruelty. But tonight, the woman I always believed in stood in front of the world again." Her chest tightened, warmth spreading through her. She wanted to protest, to remind him of her scars, her mistakes, her fears. But instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn to the comfort of his presence. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "I'm still healing, and I have a child to think about." Alexander's thumb brushed over her hand. "I'm not asking for promises, Clara. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to stand beside you, not in front of you. To protect you when you need it, but also to let you fight your own battles. A chance to love you the way you always deserved." Her tears finally fell, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of something fragile breaking open inside her chest. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be alone anymore, Alex." His arms came around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You never will be," he whispered. And for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe it. The day arrived quietly, without the glamour of a gala or the flash of cameras. It was dawn, the sky still gray, when Clara felt the first sharp wave of pain. Hours later, she was in a delivery room, clutching Alexander's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. He was by her side through every moment, calm when she panicked, steady when she faltered. He whispered encouragements, his voice the anchor that kept her from breaking. And then, after hours of struggle, the room was filled with the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, the cry of her newborn child. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as the nurse placed the baby in her arms. Tiny, perfect, with eyes squeezed shut and fists curled tight, the baby was a living miracle. Clara pressed her lips to the child's forehead, sobbing softly. "You're here. You're safe. You're mine." Alexander stood close, his eyes glistening as he gazed at them. For a man who had conquered boardrooms and bent markets to his will, this was the moment that broke him. "He's perfect," he whispered. Clara smiled through her tears. "Meet your son." The weight of the past months lifted as she held the baby. For so long she had been defined by betrayal and humiliation. Now, in her arms, was proof of resilience, proof that love could survive cruelty, that life could blossom even after devastation. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, soft lullabies, and quiet joy. Alexander was there for all of it, changing diapers with surprising skill, rocking the baby when Clara needed rest, watching over both of them with unwavering devotion. But life wasn't just about motherhood. Clara knew that if she wanted a future for her son, she had to build one. When the board of Evans Technologies, desperate to salvage the company's reputation, approached her, Clara faced a choice. They wanted her to step into a leadership role, to restore faith in the company her husband had nearly destroyed. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a businesswoman in their eyes. She was the discarded wife, the victim. But Alexander reminded her of who she truly was. "You're more than Richard's shadow, Clara. You're brilliant, creative, resilient. You don't need to prove yourself to them. You just need to be yourself, and that will be enough." With his encouragement, she accepted. Clara's first appearance at Evans Technologies as a leader was met with stunned silence. No longer the timid wife hidden behind Richard, she stood before employees and investors with poise. She spoke not in the cold language of profit margins, but with passion about integrity, innovation, and rebuilding trust. Her words resonated. For the first time in years, the company saw a leader worth following. Employees who had feared for their futures now felt hope. Investors, wary but intrigued, gave her a chance. The press captured it all. Clara, holding her newborn son in one arm, speaking with strength and vision. The image went viral. Not just a mother, not just a widow of betrayal, but a woman reborn. She had become both protector and leader, balancing late nights with feedings and early mornings with board meetings. It wasn't easy. There were tears, exhaustion, and moments of doubt. But every time she looked into her baby's eyes, she found strength she didn't know she had. And Alexander was always there, not overshadowing her, not controlling her, but standing beside her, his love steady and sure. One evening, as she rocked her son to sleep, Clara whispered, "You'll grow up in a world where truth matters, where love is strong, and where your mother never gave up." Her son's tiny hand curled around her finger, and Clara knew the nightmare was over. A new story had begun. It was nearly a year after the night that had changed everything. Spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Grand Imperial Hotel, now hosting a different kind of gala, not one of arrogance or showmanship, but of hope. The Children's Future Foundation had invited Clara Evans as the keynote speaker. The ballroom was full. Investors, activists, journalists, and everyday citizens had gathered to hear the woman whose story had captured the world. The woman who had been humiliated, broken, betrayed, and who had risen stronger than ever. Clara stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clip to her gown. In the audience, Alexander sat in the front row, their son nestled in his arms, the baby's soft coos drawing smiles from those around him. Clara's heart steadied at the sight. For years she had walked into rooms alone, uncertain, silenced. Tonight, she walked in as a woman with her family, her voice and her dignity intact. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Please welcome our guest of honor, Clara Evans." Applause thundered as she stepped into the light. She paused, letting the moment wash over her, then began. "A year ago," she said, her voice clear, "I walked into this very ballroom in fear. I walked in as a wife who had been betrayed, humiliated, and silenced. That night, I fell to the floor in pain, and I thought my story had ended there." The crowd was silent, listening intently. But it didn't end, because pain is not the end. Betrayal is not the end. That night was the beginning of something I didn't know I had inside me, strength. Her eyes swept the room, meeting faces young and old. For too long, I believed silence was survival. I believed that if I kept quiet, endured humiliation, I could protect my family. But silence nearly destroyed me. What saved me was remembering that I was more than someone's wife. I was more than someone's victim. I was a woman, a mother, a human being who deserved respect. Applause rippled through the audience, but Clara raised her hand gently, continuing, "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every woman who has ever been told to stay quiet. For every person who has been mocked, ignored, or erased. I want you to know this. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And when you find the courage to speak, you will not only save yourself, you might save others too." Her voice trembled with emotion, but her resolve was steady. "Richard Evans tried to break me. He lost everything, his company, his reputation, his freedom, because he underestimated the strength of the woman he thought he controlled. But this isn't just about him. It's about the countless people out there who need to see that, even in the darkest moments, light can return." Clara glanced toward the front row, where Alexander smiled proudly, their son resting peacefully against his chest. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she let it fall. I rebuilt my life. I found love that is real, support that is unwavering, and a future for my child that is bright. And if I can rise from the floor of that ballroom, so can you. The hall erupted in a standing ovation. People clapped, cried, shouted her name. For once, the noise didn't frighten her. It filled her with peace. As she left the stage, Alexander rose to meet her, their son between them. He kissed her temple softly. You did it, he whispered. Clara smiled through tears. No, she said, holding her baby close. We did it. And in that moment, the story that had begun in betrayal ended in bitterness, but in triumph, healing, and love. So my friends, that's how the story comes to an end. You're still here with me, right? If you stayed until now, it means something in Clara's journey touched your heart, and maybe, just maybe, it reminded you of your own strength. You see, life will break us down, people will betray us, but as the Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, we cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. Clara chose to rise. She chose courage over silence, dignity over despair, and that choice changed everything. So if you're facing struggles, remember, you are stronger than you think. Now, if this story moved you even a little, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel so together we can keep telling stories that heal.